In 1994, a former SEAL Team 6 operator sat in a metal folding chair inside a cinder block room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Across from him sat 3 Delta Force evaluators and 1 clinical psychologist. The SEAL had survived a 40-mile ruck march through the Appalachian Mountains, weeks of sleep deprivation, and physical screening that eliminated 90% of candidates before they reached this room. The psychologist looked up from his notes and said 4 words. "You can go home." The SEAL had not failed a single physical test. He had not quit. He had not broken under pressure. He had been screened out by a psychological assessment designed to detect one specific personality trait, and that trait was something SEAL training had spent years deliberately building into him. If you think the SEAL pipeline produces the ideal personality profile for Tier 1 special operations, you have that completely backwards. Delta's commander board has documented a pattern in former SEAL applicants that shows up so consistently it has become one of their primary screening targets. The trait is not arrogance, it is not recklessness, it is something far more specific, and understanding what it is changes everything you think you know about the difference between these 2 units. The commander's board at Fort Bragg is the final gate of Delta selection. By the time a candidate reaches this room, the unit already knows what his body can do. They watched him navigate alone through the mountains of West Virginia for weeks without feedback, without encouragement, without any indication of whether he was passing or failing. The physical portion is designed to break you down to your raw, psychological core. But the board is where Delta actually makes its decision. The room is small. The panel typically includes 3 to 5 senior Delta operators, at least 1 command sergeant major, and a psychologist who has spent years studying what separates operators who thrive in Delta's environment from those who do not. The questions have no right answers. They might ask your opinion on a geopolitical crisis. They might ask what you would do in a scenario with no good options. They might ask you to describe your worst failure. What they are really doing is watching how you process ambiguity, how you handle a conversation where nobody tells you whether you are on the right track, and whether you need the room to validate your answers. One of the board's favorite techniques is silence. A candidate finishes answering a question, and nobody responds. No nods, no follow-up questions. Just 5 people staring at you in a quiet room. Most military evaluations are designed to keep the candidate talking. Delta's board is designed to see what you do when nobody is talking back. Eric Haney described this board in his book Inside Delta Force. He wrote about sitting in front of the panel after weeks of physical punishment in the West Virginia mountains and realizing that these men were not interested in what he had done. They were interested in who he was when he had nothing left to perform with. When a former Navy SEAL sits in that chair, the panel is watching for something very specific. They are watching for a behavioral pattern they have seen dozens of times before. And most former SEALs do not even realize they are displaying it. The trait Delta screens against does not have one clean clinical name. Inside the selection process, evaluators have used different language over the years, but the behavior they are identifying comes down to one consistent pattern: tribal identity dependency. It shows up as an operator who has fused his personal identity so completely with his unit affiliation that he cannot function psychologically without it. His sense of competence, his confidence, his decision-making framework, all of it runs through the filter of belonging to a specific group. This is not a weakness in the traditional sense. In SEAL culture, it is a strength. The SEAL teams were built on the idea that the team is everything. BUD-S, the basic underwater demolition training that every SEAL must survive, is engineered from day one to destroy individual identity and replace it with collective identity. You suffer together. You succeed together. You are punished together for the failures of individuals. The boat crew, the swim buddy, the class number, every element of SEAL training reinforces the message that who you are alone does not matter. Who you are as part of this tribe is the only thing that counts. BUD-S has a 68% attrition rate. The first phase alone, which runs 7 weeks at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, is where most candidates are eliminated. Hell Week, which falls around week 4, is the defining crucible. 5.5 days of continuous physical training, with a total of roughly 4 hours of sleep across the entire period. Candidates run in the sand with their boat crews, paddle inflatable boats through the Pacific surf, and endure surf torture in water cold enough to induce hypothermia. Every evolution is a team event. You do not survive Hell Week alone. The candidates who ring the brass bell and quit are almost always the ones who mentally isolate themselves from their crew. The ones who survive are the ones who attach themselves most completely to the group and draw their endurance from that attachment. The ones who try to survive alone, relying on individual willpower without bonding to the team, tend to ring the bell. SEAL training is a tribal bonding machine, and it works. The men who come out of BUD/S at Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California, carry a psychological imprint that stays with them for the rest of their careers. The trident is not just a badge, it is a core identity marker. And when those men later try out for Delta Force, they walk into the commander's board carrying that imprint like a second skeleton. The problem for Delta is that tribal identity dependency creates a set of downstream behaviors that are disqualifying for how Delta operates. The first behavior the panel looks for is assertion patterning in unstructured environments. Put a tribal identity operator in a room with no clear hierarchy, no established pecking order, and no team structure, and he will immediately try to establish dominance or seek validation from the group. He will assert his background, his qualifications, his experience, not because he is arrogant in the conventional sense, but because his psychological operating system requires a social framework to function. Without a team to belong to, without a rank structure to orient himself within, he becomes visibly uncomfortable. He talks more. He fills silence. He references his former unit repeatedly. In a room full of Delta evaluators who are trained to sit quietly and offer nothing, this behavior stands out like a flare in a dark room. The second behavior is resistance to identity dissolution. Delta's entire operational model requires operators who can shed every visible and psychological marker of military identity. A Delta operator on a mission in a foreign country might be wearing civilian clothes, speaking a local language, carrying commercial electronics, and presenting himself as a businessman or an aid worker or a tourist. The mission might require him to spend weeks in this role without any contact with his unit, without any reinforcement of his military identity, without anyone around him knowing what he actually does for a living. For an operator whose sense of self is built around being a Navy SEAL, this kind of sustained identity suppression is psychologically corrosive. It creates anxiety, performance degradation, and decision-making errors that compound over time. Delta's psychologist on the board has seen this pattern play out enough times to know what it looks like in the interview stage, long before a candidate ever reaches a real operation. The third behavior is what evaluators sometimes call validation seeking under ambiguity. When the board asks a question with no right answer, the tribal identity operator will watch the faces of the evaluators for cues. He will adjust his response based on perceived reactions. He will frame his answer in terms of what his former team would have done, or what his training taught him was correct. He is not thinking independently. He is running his cognition through the filter of his group affiliation. In a SEAL platoon, this is adaptive behavior. In a Delta operation where you are alone in a foreign city making decisions that will determine whether a hostage lives or dies, this dependency on external validation is a liability that can get people killed. None of this means individual SEALs are incapable of independent thought. The point is that BUD/S and the SEAL operational culture systematically reinforce a specific set of psychological wiring, and that wiring is precisely what Delta's screen is designed to detect and remove. SEAL training architect Draper Kaufman designed the original Hell Week at the Naval Combat Demolition Unit Training School in 1943. The entire concept was built around shared suffering as a bonding mechanism. Every evolution in BUD/S is a team event. Log PT, where a boat crew hoists a telephone pole-sized log overhead for extended periods, is physically demanding, but its real purpose is to make you dependent on the men next to you. Surf torture, where candidates link arms in the Pacific Ocean until hypothermia sets in, teaches you that quitting means abandoning your brothers. The SEAL ethos itself contains the line, "My loyalty to country and team is beyond reproach." Team is capitalized. It carries the weight of an identity category, not just a professional affiliation. When a SEAL candidate graduates from BUD/S and receives his trident at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, he has undergone one of the most effective identity reconstruction programs in the military world. His brain has been rewired to derive confidence, resilience, and purpose from tribal belonging. The trident ceremony itself reinforces this. Fellow SEALs pin the trident onto the new operator's chest, often pounding it in with their fists. It is a ritual of acceptance into the brotherhood. From that day forward, the operator exists inside a culture that reinforces tribal identity at every level. The SEAL teams operate in platoons of 16 men who train together, deploy together, and often socialized together between deployments. The platoon chief and officer in charge become the operator's professional world. Team rooms at SEAL commands in Coronado and Virginia Beach function as tribal gathering spaces where the culture perpetuates itself through shared language, shared humor, and shared disdain for outsiders who do not understand. A naval postgraduate school thesis by Lieutenant Forrest Crowell documented how this tribal identity became so strong within naval special warfare that it shifted from a professional ethic into what Crowell called a market ethos, where the SEAL identity itself became a commodity. Former SEALs wrote best-selling books, they starred in Hollywood films, they ran for political office on the platform of being former SEALs. The identity had become so central to who these men were that many of them could not separate themselves from it even after leaving the service. And for the missions SEALs conduct, this wiring is highly effective. Maritime interdiction, direct action raids on confirmed targets, platoon-level combat operations. These are missions where team cohesion, mutual trust, and tribal loyalty are force multipliers. The problem is that these are not Delta's missions. Delta Force was modeled after the British Special Air Service. Colonel Charlie Beckwith spent a year embedded with 22 SAS in Hereford, England in 1962, commanding 3 Troop, a squadron. Before that assignment, Beckwith had served with the 7th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg and spent 2 years running covert operations in Laos with the White Star organization. He was already a combat-tested Green Beret. But what he saw at Hereford changed his entire understanding of what a special operations soldier could be. The SAS did not train the way American units trained. They did not emphasize group cohesion drills or team-building exercises. They selected for individuals first and then built teams out of men who could already function alone. SAS selection, held in the Brecon Beacons of Wales, was a solitary affair. Candidates navigated mountain terrain alone, carrying heavy loads, with no support and no feedback. The men who passed were not the loudest or the most aggressive, they were the most internally stable. Beckwith spent the next 15 years fighting to build an American equivalent. What Beckwith learned from the SAS was fundamentally different from the SEAL model. The SAS valued what Beckwith called the individual operator, well-read soldiers, loners who could operate independently and in the absence of orders. Men who had, in his words, just half an ounce of paranoia. Beckwith wanted men who were suspicious enough to question everything around them but controlled enough to act calmly on that suspicion. The kind of operator who could sit alone in a cafe in Beirut for 3 weeks, trusting no one, reporting to no one, and making judgment calls that would never be reviewed by a committee. When Beckwith built Delta's selection process at Fort Bragg in 1977, he deliberately structured it to identify and select for this independent operator profile. The interview board was Beckwith's invention, adapted from what he had seen the SAS do in Hereford. He wanted questions with no right answers because he believed the way a man reasons when there is no correct response reveals more about his character than any physical test. One of Beckwith's favorite board questions, according to accounts from early Delta candidates, was asking a man to describe what he does not do well. The answer itself mattered less than whether the candidate could look inward honestly without defensiveness or deflection. The ruck marches through the mountains of West Virginia are done alone. You navigate alone. You make decisions alone. You have no idea what the time standard is. You have no idea if you are passing. No one encourages you. No one tells you how much farther you have to go. This is the opposite of SEAL training, where Bud, S, strips away individual identity and replaces it with group identity. Delta selection strips away group identity and forces you to confront who you are when there is nothing and nobody around you. The candidates who thrive are the ones who do not need a team to function. They do not need external validation. They do not need someone to tell them they are doing well. They generate their own internal standard, measure themselves against it, and keep moving. If you want to understand how Delta's commander board operates differently from the team-based evaluation systems used by naval special warfare, we covered that in our video, The Personality Type Delta Force Actually Looks For. Link in the description. The psychological screen that eliminates SEAL candidates from Delta selection is not a test that anyone passes or fails in a single moment. It is a pattern of behavioral data that the board collects over the entire selection process and then confirms during the interview. The psychologist on the panel is looking at the whole picture: how the candidate behaved during the ruck marches, whether he tried to form alliances with other candidates during the few moments they were in proximity, how he handled the absence of feedback over weeks of physical testing, Whether he referenced his former unit during conversation, how he responded when the board offered no validation for his answers. The board is assembling a psychological profile, and the profile they are screening against is one that shows high team identity fusion, high need for external validation, high assertion in unstructured social environments, and low tolerance for sustained identity ambiguity. This profile correlates almost perfectly with the psychological product of SEAL training. That does not mean every former SEAL who tries out for Delta displays this profile. Some SEALs have personality structures that survive BUD/S conditioning intact. They bonded with their teams but never lost their independent psychological core. These are the SEALs who make it through Delta selection. They are the exception, not the rule. The rule is that BUD/S produces operators who are psychologically optimized for team-dependent operations, and Delta's mission profile requires the opposite. Delta's mission set since the late 1970s has consistently demanded operators who can disappear. Hostage rescues in buildings, aircraft, and embassy compounds require teams, yes, but the intelligence gathering, target development, and advanced force operations that precede those rescues require individuals who can move through foreign environments without triggering attention. Consider what advanced force operations actually look like in practice. Before Delta's assault teams ever breach a door, someone had to spend days or weeks identifying the target location, mapping the interior layout, establishing the guard rotation, and determining the number and position of hostages. In many cases, that reconnaissance was conducted by a single operator or a two-man element working without military uniforms, without visible weapons, and without any protective infrastructure. During the hunt for war criminals in Bosnia in the late 1990s, Delta operators moved through Sarajevo and other cities, posing as civilians while conducting surveillance on persons indicted for war crimes. They sat in cafes. They walked through markets. They watched buildings for days. Nobody around them had any idea that the quiet man reading a newspaper was an American military operator tracking a target for potential capture. A Delta operator in Baghdad in 2004 might spend weeks building a pattern of life on a high-value target, moving through the city in civilian clothes, interacting with locals, maintaining a cover story, and making real-time decisions about whether to escalate or withdraw. He has communication with his unit, but the decisions in the moment are his alone. There is no boat crew to lean on. There is no swim buddy to validate his read of the situation. There is no trident on his chest announcing who he is to the world. He is psychologically naked, and that is exactly where Delta needs him to be comfortable. Compare this to the SEAL operational model. SEAL Team 6, also known as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, or DEVGRU, is the Navy's Tier 1 equivalent. DEVGRU operators are extraordinary at direct action raids. They are the unit that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan in 2011. But that mission was a platoon-level raid on a confirmed target, with real-time overhead surveillance, communications with headquarters, and a team structure around every operator on the ground. It was a masterpiece of team-dependent execution. Delta's operations often look completely different. The capture of Saddam Hussein near Tikrit in 2003 involved Delta operators working with intelligence sources in conditions that looked nothing like a conventional military operation. The tracking of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq required months of patient, low-visibility intelligence work before the final strike. These operations demand a psychological profile that is comfortable being invisible, comfortable being alone, and comfortable making decisions without a team consensus. Now here is the question that Delta's own people disagree about. Is the psychological screen fair to former SEAL applicants, or is it structurally biased against a valid cultural model? Some former Delta operators argue that the screen is simply identifying the right person for the right job. Delta's missions require independent operators. SEAL culture produces team-dependent operators. The screen correctly identifies this mismatch, and there is nothing controversial about it. A plumber is not a bad tradesman because he cannot do electrical work. He is just the wrong specialist for that job. Other voices inside the special operations community push back on this argument. They point out that Delta's board evaluation is inherently subjective. The psychologist is making judgment calls about what constitutes excessive team identity versus healthy professional pride. Where is the line between an operator who references his former SEAL platoon because he is tribal identity dependent and one who references it because he is simply describing his professional background? The interview format itself may disadvantage operators who were trained to communicate in team-oriented language. A SEAL who says my platoon handled that situation effectively is using culturally appropriate language for his community. A Delta evaluator might score that same statement as evidence of group dependency. There is also the argument that Delta's selection process has a self-reinforcing bias. The board is composed of current Delta operators who were themselves selected for independent personality profiles. They are naturally going to evaluate candidates through the lens of their own psychological wiring. An introvert who sits quietly in the interview, speaks carefully, and never references his former unit fits the Delta archetype. An extroverted SEAL, who communicates confidently, uses team language, and projects his identity outward, does not fit the archetype. But projecting identity is not the same thing as being dependent on tribal identity. The screen may be conflating communication style with psychological structure. Some of the finest operators in American special operations history have been loud, confident, identity-forward personalities who also happen to be brilliant independent decision-makers. The question is whether Delta's screen can tell the difference, or whether it just selects for a specific temperament that happens to correlate with the Army's Special Forces culture and penalizes a different temperament that happens to correlate with naval special warfare. The honest answer is that nobody outside the commander's board knows for certain. Delta does not publish its screening criteria. The psychological assessment tools used in the interview are classified. Everything we know comes from the accounts of candidates who went through the process and the few former operators like Eric Haney and George Hand who have written about life inside the unit. What is clear is that the screen exists, that it has a documented effect on former SEAL applicants, and that the trait it targets is something Bud S is specifically designed to build. Whether Delta is right or wrong about this trait comes down to what you think special operations should optimize for. If you believe the future of Tier 1 operations is team-based direct action, then SEAL culture produces the better operator. If you believe the future is low-visibility intelligence-driven operations where individuals disappear into foreign populations, then Delta's model wins. Both arguments have evidence behind them. The Bin Laden raid in Abbottabad was a team operation executed by DevGru, with helicopter support, real-time satellite imagery from the CIA, and constant communication with the White House Situation Room. It was a triumph of coordinated team execution. The hunt for Zarqawi in Iraq was something entirely different. Delta operators and intelligence analysts spent months building a network diagram of Zarqawi's inner circle, turning sources, and tracking couriers through Iraqi cities. The final strike was an airstrike on a safe house near Bakba in June 2006. But the years of patient intelligence work that made that strike possible required operators who could work alone, stay invisible, and resist the psychological need for team reinforcement during months of ambiguous, unglamorous work. The global war on terror produced missions that vindicated both models, and that is precisely why this debate has no clean resolution. The question the comment section is going to fight about is this: is Delta screening out a genuine psychological liability, or is the board rejecting SEAL applicants because their training gave them a communication style and cultural identity that looks like a liability, but functions as a strength in the right environment? Tell us what you think. And if you want the other half of this story, watch the personality type Delta Force actually looks for. It is the companion to everything you just heard, and it explains what Delta's board actually selects for when they find the operator they want.